Well, thanks for joining us again for another study here in Mark's Gospel, now into chapter 7. And like usual, my name is Tyler Helfers, and I'm at Iowa State University and joined by Scott Stark at Grand Valley State and Steve Coy up at Queens University. But we have someone new with us today, and so I'm going to turn it over to him just to introduce himself and say a little bit of where he's from. But yeah, go ahead and take it away.
Tyler, my name is Tyler Ward. I'm at Loyola University in Chicago, and I help pastor Agape and Ecclesia, which is a community on campus we're somewhere between a traditional church and a campus ministry model. But that's we've been here for I've been here for 7 years. Agape and Ecclesia has been here for about 10. But yeah, I'm originally from North Carolina, and yeah, that was not in the best order, I realize, but I think that's all the information.
I think it works, and you got the right name, so that's good.
Yes.
It's a great start, Tyler. Way to be.
Yes. But with that, I'll open us in prayer, and then we will go ahead and jump into Mark 7. So let's pray. Father, we thank you for the opportunity to meet together, to open your word, and we ask now that we might hear from you as we bring our thoughts and insights that we, as we've been reading and thinking about this text, but that your Spirit would be at work, opening our eyes and our hearts to hear and receive the message that you have for us out of your word. Father, we thank you that you reveal yourself to us in a way that we can begin to understand and begin to know you, but also to be amazed and left in awe of who you are and what you are doing in our world. So we thank you for this time. We ask your blessing on our conversation. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, with that, I will turn it over to you, Scott, because I think you, this is like the first time, right, in our discussions, but we have a visual aid. But you've got a map for us and some thoughts here just at the outset of setting the stage.
Yeah. And this is something that I find really helpful, understanding the kind of geographical landscape. So I've commented on this a few times, but I thought it might be helpful to share just a little bit about what we're looking at and where we are in the story. So can everybody see me okay there? Can you see the map?
Yep.
Great. So when we finished up chapter 6, his disciples were leaving this kind of region here that that was supposed to be this quiet place, ended up being the feeding of thousands. They were on their way to here over at Bethsaida, but it says the wind was against them, and they end up way over here. Jesus walks on the lake. It's this incredible story of Jesus comes out to them walking on the lake in the midst of all this. We're not going to cover that because that was last chapter. But long story short, they end up way over here in Gennesaret. And Jesus does some amazing ministry there, which is where we pick up the story in chapter 7. But he ends up being in a pretty contentious conversation with some Pharisees and the teachers of the law. That happens right here in the thick of Jesus' home territory, where his ministry has been thriving now for 6 chapters. Really the whole story of Mark, Jesus is thriving in ministry largely in this region, except for his own town of Nazareth over here a bit. That didn't go quite as well. The other thing we took note of last week was that this is the capital city of the region of Galilee, where Herod's palace is, his main palace in the capital. And Jesus, it seems, never enters this space. All of Jesus' ministry is all in here. And we had the conflict of kingdoms that we talked about last time, where you have the kingdom of Herod, which abuses the sheep and kills the prophets. in contrast with the kingdom of Jesus up here with no palace, but where Jesus cares for his sheep, feeds them, and has compassion for them, right? We talked a bit about that last week. And now Jesus is back in this territory, in Gennesaret. There's some ministry that's about to happen. The second story we see in chapter 7, Jesus decides to go way over here to Tyre, which is in, as you can see right here, the Phoenician area. Not nearly the kind of Jewishness and Jewish lifestyle expectations that you would find way here in Galilee. Jesus is way over here in Tyre, very culturally different kind of a place, and that helps shape how we understand and read what happens in the story of Jesus and the woman that he interacts with in Tyre. And then Jesus leaves Tyre and goes all the way down here through Galilee, crosses the sea, and back to the Decapolis, where we first met Jesus in the Decapolis. He heals this man who has a legion of demons a few chapters back. And so now Jesus is going back to what is all pagan land. This is very much not Jewish land in terms of culturally Jewish, very culturally Roman. So Jesus is all over the map, is my point in this story. And Steve's going to kind of walk us into the story a little bit more. But hopefully that sense of the traveling of Jesus and the cultural context that he's in helps to frame how we read this section. Did that make sense? Just somebody tell me that that made a little bit of sense.
I loved it. I think it was great. And, I think just kind of getting the map as a frame of reference gives us basically a stark overview almost of the passage. And so I think it's brilliant. I think it's really helpful because I actually didn't even realize how far they traveled. And so thanks, Scott. Don't you think Scott's a great guy? Yes. The whole internet just agreed with that.
Yeah. Awesome.
So and you kind of highlight, right? Like 3 sections in the Bible, right? So we've got these 3 sections. One is the religious leaders come to Jesus and they challenge the disciples about purity. The disciples were not good at washing their hands, right? So it's just a coronavirus nightmare, really. And who knows how they were doing with social distancing? Probably not well. But so the Pharisees are just like so upset. And Jesus, actually, there's a lot of verses that Jesus dedicates to correcting religious thinking about purity, right? So there's that religious thinking about purity. Then we have this Greek woman's daughter, this Greek woman from Syrophoenicia, probably from way up on the map that we saw. She comes and she begs Jesus to heal her daughter. And then we see another healing. Jesus heals a deaf and mute man. So the three kind of sections. I'm not sure who's going to go deep into those, but I just wanted to give a big, broad overview of 4 big themes that I saw. And I didn't do this on purpose, but this actually just kind of happened as it tends to do. But so these 4 themes, you can say it's an acronym, QUIP, Q-U-I-P, just to remember. And what's interesting about quip is a witty statement. So isn't that interesting? So first of all, thank you. So quip, right? So 4 big themes, and then I'll let you guys kind of do lots with it. First, quality. I saw the theme of quality. And this one line stood out in verse 37. I'm not sure if it stood out for you guys. It says, people said this about Jesus. He has done everything well. And I was like, wow, there's so much to unpack there. It's the sense of quality. The second is understanding, and that's where I have the most notes on, the sense of understanding. And I think as I looked at the 3 stories and actually kind of 4 snapshots through the whole chapter, there was this theme of understanding. There are different degrees of understanding, and Jesus is like either really impressed or really frustrated with people's levels of understanding all the way through. Then I saw the theme of intercession, how people are bringing people to Jesus. Other people are bringing other people to Jesus. And then, the big section, right? Purity. We could talk about purity, living a life of holiness. So that's the QUIP: quality, understanding, intercession, purity. 4 big themes, but you can launch into wherever you want to go.
Yeah.
No, I think that's really helpful. I mean, even as we're doing this in part to model a little bit of Bible study methods and ways of engaging the text, and I think that that's really helpful for even just wrapping your mind around an entire chapter, is finding those themes, those big ideas that sort of pop out. So no, thanks for that. And I might just jump in to get us started on some of the smaller sections. In particular, I was drawn to right in the middle, and Jesus and this Syrophoenician woman. And one of the reasons that I'm drawn to this story is sort of, and it goes into the next one as well, but it's sort of the way that I feel like chapters 6 and 7 sort of follow this similar pattern in the way they're laid out. So, at the beginning of 6, you have Jesus, basically being rejected in his hometown. And as the chapter goes along, you see him being received by others, right? So you move from rejection in his hometown to the 5,000 gathering to hear from him, right? They followed along the river or the lake to get to where he and the disciples end up going to try to get away from the crowds. And then the end of that chapter, that it says that all the people were amazed, and when people continue to hear, even after they had traveled again, more and more people kept coming, right? So you move from rejection to receiving. And then in chapter 7, you start with sort of tradition and the people of Israel, and you progress to the new thing that God in Christ is doing, and all the peoples, right? And one of the, and even in saying that, I wrote a note down that said, right, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but that tradition in itself isn't bad, but Jesus points out the way that this tradition has been exalted, and made higher than the law and made higher than probably even God, right? In terms of where they are focusing their attention, and where they're aiming their hearts, um, and so by the time we get to this woman in the vicinity of Tyre, we're thinking, probably, I should say, not necessarily we, but the reader is probably thinking, the initial reader, right, the one that Mark's writing to initially, is probably thinking, okay, I'm not really sure where we're going here or what's going to happen, because people were well aware of how perhaps toxic the relationship was between Israel, the Jewish people, and the peoples and the lands around them. And we even get a little bit of a picture of this in how Jesus speaks, right? There's an aspect of testing and kind of teasing out, what is this woman, how is she thinking, what is she wanting, and in a sense, how does she view who I am and what God is doing in and through me. And this comes out in the language of their interaction, right? She wants her daughter to be exorcised of this demon, and Jesus says, let the children eat all they want, for it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to dogs. Whoa, wait a second. What kind of a statement is that? One, as we're reading a text, right, we got to figure out, what are all these words? What are they identifying? Who are they signifying, right? So who are the children? Well, obviously, my mind goes back to Abraham and the children of Abraham, and all that language around family and children, descendants, that I think it's very obvious that that's who he's got in mind, that Israel, the Jewish people, are the the children, and they've been given this bread. We think about John's gospel. You've got Jesus identifying himself as the bread of life. And so he's clearly saying, the work that God is doing in and through me is intended to manifest itself in and among the people of Israel. And yet she says, in response to all this, yeah, but even the dogs under the table get the crumbs from the children. I think about our daughter and how messy she can be at the dinner table. And some of the time it's because she's still learning to use, a fork or a spoon. But a lot of the time it's because she just simply isn't paying attention or being real. She doesn't care. Right. And I kind of liken it to that this woman identifies several things. One, she identifies the fact that the people of Israel, perhaps as we look at the rest, what has preceded this in this gospel, they haven't always been the most attentive to who Jesus is and what he's doing. That there are those who don't care, right? They've hardened themselves to his message and to his work. They're standing opposed to Jesus. But then also, I think she identifies the other aspect of that blessing that comes through Abraham and his children, right? That ultimately they are going to be blessed, but that blessing is intended for all people. And so as a result of the Israelites, whether it's their hardening, their lack of attentiveness, or their rejection, whatever it is, that has caused these crumbs to fall, that God is using them and intending them for the good of all people. And so when Jesus sees that she not only recognizes him as, this special one, this Lord, this Messiah, but recognizes that he's the one through whom the blessing is going to come, he immediately says, your daughter is healed. And to me, this just is the kind of the highlight in terms of thinking about the way that promise finds fulfillment, that as Jesus is doing these, and to some extent new, and yet really according to God's intent, not new things in the world, we see that blessing going out to all people, starting with this Syrophoenician woman and her daughter. So it's just another example in Mark's gospel. We talked a few weeks back about the demon-possessed man, but the way that Jesus is showing his blessing to all these different peoples. So that was what stood out to me. I'm curious, Steve, in terms of your themes, what sort of stood out to you with that story, or are there any particular ways you feel like that one connects to the themes?
Yeah, I mean, you've given some really good insights there, Tyler. I think there's so many different ways we could approach this, but the understanding, I think, is probably the biggest theme that kind of deals with what the Pharisees, but also the woman too. And maybe let me maybe try framing it a different way and see how those things intersect. And so I think one of the really big themes that I saw was a sense of understanding. And it's been a theme in Mark that we've already seen, right? The parable of the lamp, which is one we talked about a few weeks ago, how Jesus wants to give understanding. And then I feel like there are at least 4 different characters or groups of people who have different interactions with this understanding. So I think Jesus is trying to reveal himself, and it has to do with what Jesus is all about. It's about his mission and really his desire to connect people to God. and to show what God's really like. And so you've got the Pharisees who didn't seem to have any understanding at all, which is really ironic because these were the religious leaders, right? These were the guys who people looked up to for their insight, like, teach us. And they're the ones who had the least understanding. And maybe that's kind of what you were talking about too, Tyler. They just didn't have any understanding. So what they got it all wrong, and they missed the point. And that's like that whole big section, right? They were missing the main point of God's directions. They misinterpreted principles, and then they misguided people. And the big reason, I think, is because they were so close to the Spirit. They were so close to God. They didn't recognize that Jesus was sent from God. And so they were really closed. And it's interesting, verse 14, Jesus says, I love these words, listen to me and understand. And that's almost like a bit of a thesis. Listen to me and understand. And so you got the Pharisees who didn't have any understanding. Then you've got the disciples who afterwards are like, hey, Jesus, can you help us understand what you just talked about? And Jesus like pulls his hair out a little bit, I think. And so they were learning, but they missed so much, right? So they're better off than the Pharisees. But Jesus actually gets upset at them and calls them dull because because of their lack of understanding. But then this woman, right, which is almost a real highlight of the chapter in terms of understanding, because she had an unusual and surprising level of understanding. And she shouldn't have had this understanding because, she was way off the map, going back to Scott's opening comments, right? She was not an Israelite. She shouldn't have had that level of understanding. But yet she did have this deep level of understanding. And where does that understanding come from? It only comes from God. And so I think Jesus is actually just kind of blown away by how much faith and understanding she actually has, right? She calls Jesus Lord. And apparently in verse 28, right? That's the only time in Mark that Jesus is called Lord, apparently, what I read. And she falls in submission and humility to Jesus. And Jesus is just like, wow. So it's this woman who's she's the pinnacle, right? You got the Pharisees, boom, they're not even there. And then the disciples, well, okay. And then this Phoenician woman who's who gets it. And then it's almost just to top it off, then there's the deaf man who's a personification of someone who wasn't even able to understand, right? And I did a little bit of research. I don't have all my good commentaries at home, so I had to trust the internet a little bit on this one. We'll see. But the Greek word apparently, alalos, can mean completely speechless or just impossible to understand. And I was like, what? So this deaf man was someone who just couldn't even understand. And what does Jesus do? He actually says to him, Ephatha, right? Be opened up. And there's a sense of physical, but also presumably spiritual opening up to God. So I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but that's kind of how I see the sense of understanding, right? Jesus wants everyone to understand, and he's revealing himself. I'm not sure. Tell me if that's helpful, or jump off, or steer us a different way, please.
No, I think so. And really, I just was curious. I've seen, right, your four themes begin to trace themselves through the details of these stories. Thanks for drawing that out with the different groups of people. Tyler, I don't want to leave you out. If there were any thoughts, or just in your initial sort of reading and reflecting on Mark 7, anything that stood out to you?
Yeah, sure. I think a couple thoughts that I had. I didn't get to do a ton of the background work. I sort of came at it almost, especially in that first story, kind of reflexively thinking, there's a very easy narrative here of sort of thinking of the Pharisees as the fundamentalists who don't get it, and then seeing Jesus, or seeing us as the authentic ones who really understand that what matters is the heart, or what matters is what's coming. And of course Jesus says as much, right? He says it's coming from the inside, but I feel like there's maybe something a little bit deeper here in a way that we can, or I think, let's see, what was it I wrote down? How can we do this, or how can we come to this particular story with an understanding that bodies are also like really important, and that the physical is also really important. And how does that play into that? Because obviously, even when you get to the story at the end and the healing of the deaf and mute man, there's a very physical element to that. Jesus's choice of healing, it's not simply spoken, but it's enacted in some very strange way. And so I think for me, what I found most interesting here, or the questions I found myself having, was what is the interplay between the internal, the external, the physical and the spiritual. And I don't think there's just this immediate divide that we can, what is it? I think oftentimes we are really drawn to that divide, and it's, I don't think it's nearly as simple as that, nor was that the world they were coming from. And so I don't think I have any information, but I think that's sort of where I'm, those are the questions that I found myself asking. How do we do this? Here's another one. Sorry, I'm just now finding a lot of my notes. So when Jesus says, listen to me, everyone, and understand this, nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. And what I wrote was, how do we read this non-Gnostically, or or how do we read this in a way that still honors like the physical, the embodied, the material? So I don't necessarily know the answer, but I felt the temptation to read it that way. So I was like, oh, I should probably,
Yeah. And Scott, I don't know exactly where, if you're wanting to dive into that section more or not. But, just kind of riffing on what you just said, Tyler, I think one of the things that as of late has stood out to me about this is that at no point does Jesus, he doesn't reject or say that the things that they're doing are wrong, but it's the way in which they've begun to the space that they occupy in terms of where their priorities, or where their the way in which they are viewing others. Then, right, there is this not merely external, but this interpersonal sort of element to their actions. And rather than there being a conversation or space for thinking, right, between whether it's Jesus's disciples and the Pharisees or whoever, about, how do we best seek to, right, using Steve's language of purity, right? How do we best embody this idea of purity and enact that in our physical actions as well as our spiritual life? Because as I read the end of that section, I thought, this is such an interesting list, because I think of so many of these things as physical actions, right? And so this idea of that they're conceived of in the heart, there's a spiritual kind of foundation to them, but they're all going to be embodied and active things that we do in our lives, in our actions. And so, I don't know that that's necessarily getting us an answer, but it's kind of adding to those thoughts. No, thanks a lot. Scott, maybe we'll turn it back to you, and you take us where you want to take us next.
Yeah, well, there's so many fascinating roads that we've wandered down today. It's hard to say, let's just stay here and not go play in those other places. But I'm going to build on what we've started talking about, because I think that might be the most helpful thing to do. But I'm going to do it from a framework of thinking about Jesus as a disciple maker, right? So here's Jesus, and he's trying to teach his disciples to be like him, right? And they're not getting it. right? We see that in the first story. There's, they kind of pull Jesus aside in verse 17, and please, can you explain this to us? What do you mean by what goes into a person is not what makes them unclean, but what comes out of them? And Jesus says, you're not getting it. I just want to pause there and say to my friends on this call, have we not all been there? Like, oh, you're not getting it. I really want you to get it. And so to pick up on what you said, Tyler Ward, right? An embodied faith, an embodied discipleship. Jesus doesn't try to explain to them primarily. He does tell them what happens. He kind of reiterates something he's already said. Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them, which is exactly what he just said to the whole crowd a minute ago. Instead, he takes them on a trip. All right, guys, we're going on a road trip. Let's go. Instead of trying to explain it all to get the right content in their heads, he's going to give them experience so that they get this. And where do they go? We're going to go all the way to freaking Tyre, way up there where the pagans live. And Jesus is going to give them an experience of the reality that it's not what goes in, but what comes out. Because what comes out of this Syrophoenician woman is a faith that rivals anything else that we've seen so far in the whole story up to this point. And Jesus takes note of that. So way up in this place where you would not expect to find it, the Spirit of God was at work. And this woman who would be unclean by her very nature. I mean, quite literally, it was her nature to be unclean from as far as Jewish customs would go in the day. And it's her that receives Jesus. And because she receives Jesus, she receives fullness. And those who rejected Jesus way back in his own town or his own place walked away empty. Right? And there's this interplay that's constantly happening, right? We're seeing Mark chapter 4, verse 24 and 25, as Steve noted a minute ago, the parable of the lamp, right? Mark is showing us what that looks like in real life. The parable of the lamp, where Jesus says, those who have much will be given more, and those that do not, even what they have will be taken away, right? We're seeing that in the first story. What they have, they got it. They should have it. And now it's being taken away, and it's being given to those who do have, which is surprisingly all the way over in Tyre. And then you travel all the way down to the Decapolis, right? Paganville. Here's the people that don't have. They don't get it. And here's the one where, again, we have reception, right? Those who receive Jesus receive fullness. And those who've rejected him walk away empty. And we're just seeing that play out consistently here. And so again, we could talk about any one of those things, but to think about Jesus as disciple maker, I think there's a real challenge and a real invitation for us to an embodied disciple making, not a disciple making of content primarily, although that's an important part of it, but that content is always matched with an experience. And so when his disciples aren't getting it, Jesus says, all right, road trip, we're going to walk. We're going to walk a long way, and we're going to get in a boat, and I'm going to show you what this looks like. And you're going to see something that you don't expect to see. Because those who receive me receive fullness, even if they're the last people you expect to receive it. So I just think we get to see Mark 4 played out in real time. But I think for me as a disciple maker, that's the challenge I'm walking away from this text, is that instead of, when I feel frustrated that the people I'm discipling maybe aren't getting it, or not getting it the way I want them to, what Jesus does is, instead of trying to explain more, he says, we're going to go live this out. We're going to go get an experience of this. And I find that to be a really useful way to approach disciple making, as Jesus shows us here.
Yeah. If other thoughts come to mind, feel free to interject them with regard to the text. But I might just invite, in this last part of our time together, as we're thinking about application, building on what you just said, Scott, I might invite each of you just to share a little bit about what does discipling or right? Mentoring, faith formation, right? However you want to articulate some of these things. How does this take shape in your ministries? What does that look like in terms of, right, bringing together, whether it's the biblical text, theology, right, the knowledge and understanding that comes, through the mind, along with, right, the heart and the hands, right, that embodied, lived out, experiential piece. What does discipleship or spiritual formation look like in your respective ministries? Maybe we'll go clockwise according to my screen, and so we'll start there with Steve, go to Scott, and then Tyler.
You're muted, Steve.
You healed me. Thanks for not spitting on me. I appreciate that. The reason I muted, my dogs were barking like crazy, and I wish they were muted. So I was like, I never mute. But thanks for calling me together. Well, so I have 3 L's that I'm thinking about, and it's a really great question you asked, Tyler. And so I want to answer by saying here are 3 things that we're leaning into and we're striving after, but have not accomplished in great fullness, right? Like we're not just like, oh, we've arrived, but at least 3 things that we want to do, and they all start with the letter L, just for your convenience. Learning from Jesus, right? And so, and again, we keep circling back to Mark 4, right? But Jesus says, pay close attention to what you hear from me. The closer you listen to me, the more you're going to understand. So one of the absolute keys that we said in terms of discipleship is listening to Jesus. Like if we want to be effective as a disciple, be a follower of Jesus, we need to listen to Jesus. And so we spend a lot of time listening, really meditating on the word, and really opening ourselves up to what Jesus wants to teach us. And so I call that learning from Jesus. And the challenge, so I'm challenging each of these things. So my challenge in that is, okay, what can I do to learn more from Jesus? There's always so much to learn. And I'm like one of those disciples who's like, help me just to understand. I'm not sure I'm getting this. So learning from Jesus. The secondly, loving like Jesus. And really, I feel like a lot of that whole part about that which defiles, which it says in the NIV, or like the purity thing. Jesus is like, you didn't get what God's heart was behind all this, right? Like you didn't just give commands just for the sake of like following commands, but it's like these things reflect God's heart. And so loving with God's heart is about developing relationships. It's about loving God. It's about really developing deep community, which I think we're realizing more and more in this time, how important in-person physical community is. So community is really big for us. And we're wondering, as we look ahead to September, like, well, how do we build online community, in the same way? So, learning from Jesus, loving like Jesus, developing good relationships, and living for Jesus. And this is really, I think, trying to live out God's values. And if we had more time, we could talk about that excellence, right? God had like the quality. Everything he did was excellent. I'm like, man, what if I live like that? And I know I can't be perfect, but like striving for excellence, striving for purity. And we're going through a process right now of trying to identify what are the values of our community that are Christ-like values, that are disciple values that we need to be living into. So those would be the 3 things I talk about: learning from Jesus, loving like Jesus, living for Jesus is how I characterized it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. Scott, what about you?
Yeah, no, that's great. And following up on that, I think, as I noted a moment ago, the 2 things from this that I'll take note of. One is that I find a great deal of comfort in the fact that Jesus, with his disciples, here's Jesus, the Son of God, explaining this to them, and they're not getting it. So I find comfort in that as a disciple maker myself, on both ends of it, as a person who's discipled to Jesus and a person who disciples others into Jesus. I find a great deal of comfort that Jesus was there with them, trying to help them understand, and still, it didn't always take the way he wanted it to. As a teacher and a disciple maker, there's an awful lot of grace in that to me. Jesus didn't seem to experience the not getting at his disciples as his own personal failure, but saw the opportunity to continue to invest in them in different ways. And so I take a great deal of comfort and grace from that, to not carry the fact that maybe folks don't always get it as my own personal failure in some way, but as opportunity, that God might be putting something new in our pathway that's going to shape us all differently. So I find grace in that. Secondly, it is the experiential part of their learning. And Jesus actually takes that quite seriously all the time, which we see in the text. Jesus is not much of a classroom learner or classroom instructor, as far as we can tell. He is an on-the-road teacher. He's more of a master electrician than he is a professor of electrical engineering. I love professors of electrical engineering. That is not a shot. It's just a methodology of Jesus is much more learning on the road. And so when his disciples aren't getting it, he takes them and gives them a very disorienting experience so that they can see it differently. Two very disorienting experience that would have made them extremely dissonant to go to Tyre and then to go down to the Decapolis, which culturally would have been about as distant from good blue blood Galilee as you could be. And so Jesus values the person, like the actual experience of what it takes to see. And I think that is for us in our ministry, as an example, we take pilgrimage seriously. That's where we kind of talk about it. Like pilgrimage events, whether they be mission trips or conferences, or we have a trip that goes actually to Israel, Palestine for learning, to experience the walking the land of Jesus. But all of those kind of things, the way we do discipleship is really something we want to do on the road. There's learning that comes with it. There's times when you sit and just listen at Jesus' feet, as Steve noted, right? The learning from Jesus. But part of the learning from Jesus for us, and I think is always true, is that we're learning on the way. And so helping to cultivate experiences where we are disoriented enough from our normal life that it allows us to be reoriented to who God is and what God's doing in much bigger ways than I could have imagined in the small framework that I'm working with, is part of learning from Jesus. So it's a deep value that is a part of kind of a part of our ministry, and I'd say a part of my own DNA, both as a pastor, as a father, and as a disciple of Jesus myself.
That's great. Tyler, what about you? What do some of these things look like in your ministry there?
I think something that Scott, you mentioned this several times. I tend towards being a content person, and I'm just like, if we had enough stuff, or if we had the right frameworks, we just need another framework, which is oftentimes just not the case. But I convince myself that it is. I think it's very important, but much of the time I think I overemphasize that stuff. But for us, what I've found to be really important has been, and I want to maybe flesh this out a little bit because it sounds really basic, but just the idea of the lordship of Jesus, and taking for, this is trying to think the best way to say this, essentially taking for granted that the kingdom has come means that every aspect of your life is then lived under this new reality, which there again is like really big language, but what I mean to say is that if you enter into a space, whether it's very physically or whether it's a relationship for finances or the classroom, with taking for granted that Jesus is Lord there, it means that you can then come to these stories and learn how to, I can't remember if it was Dallas Willard. He had some phrase, something like living your life as though Jesus would if he were you, like that sort of thing, right? That very basic sort of entering into a place, taking for granted that God is already present and doing something here, and seeing, okay, where can we participate? Where can we discern what God is already doing in this relationship, in this person's life, in this classroom, rather than assuming that we can show up and just figure it out. Trusting that God is already present here, and that there is a way of going about these aspects of your life that looks like Jesus. So I think it's just, for us, the discipleship piece has leaned heavily on trusting that Jesus is Lord across the board. And that's not only saying that God is in charge, but it's saying that this very particular person is in charge. So that's and this person is Jesus. That means that it's not the sort of in charge that we know, but it's the one who is Lord is also the one who is patient, who isn't coercive, who is very careful and very thoughtful. And so it's all those sorts of things, right? It's like, it's getting to know Jesus, but then also getting to know that Jesus is in charge. Like that's the, for us, or for me at least, that's what I try to kind of hone in on. But yeah.
Yeah. I think in some ways my own thoughts are sort of similar to this. And that idea, I try to pose the question to our students that, what is God doing in the places where you find yourself? Whether, it's in the classroom or at home, at work, on the street, wherever it is that you are at. What might God be doing there? And what role might you play in this? And then I think sort of related is just this idea of creating not just, right, I want to teach and have good conversation and give resources, but how can I encourage our students, how can you form habits and patterns? Are there certain practices that will prove incredibly beneficial and dovetail with the things you're learning and reading and discussing and praying about and for, and to recognize the value of practices and patterns and habits, right? And not to simply, right? I think one of the things that Tyler sort of alluded to at the beginning was the beginning of this chapter is the temptation to sort of just throw everything out the window, that, it's stuffy and old, and, traditions just breed a fundamentalist kind of thought and dead faith. But if we find those patterns and habits that can direct us to God and open our eyes to see his working in the world, I think that those habits and patterns can be really instrumental in our witness to those around us. So, I might just wrap us up there, and we can jump into Mark 8 next week. Like always, I appreciate everyone being able to join us. And Tyler, thanks for dropping in today. And know that you are welcome. So with that, thanks, and have a blessing, or I should say thanks and blessings on the rest of your week. And we'll see you again next time.